All right, so in this, I want to kind of go over design issues, and my CPU for some reason is really hot, so you're going to hear the fan whirring. I apologize, but got to make the video sooner or later, and I have a limited amount of free time. So here's where it's starting off at, and from a design perspective, which hasn't been covered in class or in the videos, there's a few problems here. The first one being that the fonts used look like the typical default fonts. There is an inconsistent images being used here. This image in the upper left is a flat image file. You could make this an SVG or some other vector-based format. So it's using flat design, flat colors, very low contrast. Most of this stuff is not heavily saturated in the color spectrum. And then down here you have this image, which has lots of contrast, a lot going on, very busy, different colors all over the place, and most of these colors are heavily saturated. So these two things are fighting for visual attention. In general, you're going to work with designers, and they're going to pick out pictures and things that kind of go together, have the same, similar or the same color scheme, or that draw out the user's eye. So this is taking up a huge amount of attention. Then we got the featured work and some placeholder images. We can see it's not very responsive. So we're going to have to fix that up a little bit. So over here on the left, this is sort of the redesigned version. Here we're using specially designed fonts. The color scheme comes from this, so you can pretty clearly see where it's drawing the colors from. The main image has been desaturated. It's been converted to sepia, and it's been blurred a little bit. And this can all be done in CSS, and I'll show you that in a second. And then we can see that we have two fonts, one of which is being used for the body, one of which is being used for the headings and titles. Typically, the headings and titles font is going to be a serif-based font. And for those not familiar, serif refers to these little characters hanging off the end of the K's, the R's, those little glyphs there. Those are known as serifs. And then the sans serif font, you can see there's no little wings on any of this stuff. So that's what we're starting off at. So first up, how do we get fonts? If you're not a designer and you don't know your typography too well, fortunately, there is a great website to help you out. That is fontpair.co. Designers have paired together fonts that they think go together. That means they have similar weights and bodies and other things that makes them work very well together. The one that I picked is Josephine Sands and Playfair Display. So if you go in there and you start typing, you can get the fonts that you want. You have the choice of either downloading it or grabbing it from Google, which is the way that I went about doing it. And that's because it gives you a really easy way to select the fonts. And then whenever you go to embed, it's very easy to use the standard. Just copy and paste that in, and then copy and paste these CSS rules. One thing that I would do, or that I would recommend, is that for your body font, it's not important really that you have a wide variety of body styles. Maybe the italic one would be a good choice to add in there. But for the display ones, you probably want to have for your titles bold and bold 700. And this all has to do with something known as pseudo bolding and pseudo italicizing. And that is if you tell your computer to bold or italicize a font and it doesn't know how, then it just makes things thicker or just kind of skews things in the italicized version. The problem with that is that there's something known as kerning, and font designers spend a lot of time making sure that kerning is applied. So you can see this A and the V, there's a huge gap between there. And then on WA, there's no gap at all. So they spend time trying to make sure that these fonts are more consistent between each other whenever you use these sorts of styling. So using the actual bold and the actual italicized version is much more visually pleasing than using the sort of the pseudo version. But for our purposes, I'm just using the two default ones. So you can see this R and this O are kind of like clobbering each other. That's what happens whenever you use the pseudo bolding, is you can run into issues like that with kerning. So anyone who has an eye for typography will start twitching in the corner of their eye whenever they look at this. So that's first up. We picked out our fonts. Then whenever we go into looking at how they're actually being used, this is using CSS3. One of the really nice things in CSS3 is that we finally get the ability to use variables. And this is what they look like. This :root, that just means the root of the document. So you can define different colors and different functions and filters for different pieces of your website. So if you were to have something like this, then you could do override the dark green, and then that would say, I don't know what a dark green would look like from the top of my head, but I could do something like that. It's actually a very bright green, but I could do something like that. And then instead of anything just being applied from root, if it was inside of a div, it would use the second style, not the first. But you'll typically see this, and it's really nice because it just gives you a good visual indicator. The color selectors over here aren't as good as the ones that are inside of the JetBrains IDE. The JetBrains IDE gives you much better color than this one does, because you can't see between light green and dark green on this. So these are more like general colors, I guess, rather than like the actual colors and what they'll look like. So where do we get colors from? How do we know if this thing matches? To do that, we go to Adobe Color. It used to be called Cooler, K-U-L-E-R, and they finally just made it Adobe Color. When you click on this, or you click on a little image icon sometimes, you will be taken to this, and that's where you can select your theme. So in this case, the theme was the Programmer at Home. Click Open. You'll see that it selects different colors from the backgrounds, and you can drag it if you want to make a custom version. Whenever you save that out, whenever you save this thing in, it's going to make me sign in. I'm already signed in, so it's making me sign in after I signed in. Good job, Adobe. But there it goes. It saves it to a library. You can name that theme. Thank you, Blur. When I switch to the color wheel, it has those colors actually saved out. So now I can grab the RGB values and I can pull them in. And you can see here that most of these are on the desaturated side of things. If, however, I went to the image and I'd pick this one, and then I'll switch back over to the color wheel here, you can see these are on the heavily saturated side. So the further inward, the less saturated, the further out, the more saturated. So these guys are heavy saturation, which makes a difference on what sort of font, or not font, but what sort of colors you can use for your main text. So from there, I used the original image, this thing, Program at Home, opened it out, chose the color wheel, saved out these values, and then that became these values that are right here. The only ones that I added are these light gray and dark gray. It's quite common for companies to create their own versions of gray, light gray and dark gray, and create their own versions of black and white. And the reason for this is that the default white and default black, true white and true black are just so heavy in contrast that most people choose to sort of dial it down a little bit. And since there's so many different shades of gray, they can contrast with each other. You can see these little breakpoints sort of whenever it switches between the different grays. They will choose a default gray for light and dark and then just use that instead of having multiple versions conflicting across the website. Usually if a designer hasn't worked on a project, one of the first things they'll do is comb the different web pages and look for those sorts of inconsistencies and then start bringing them into a style guide that sort of lays out how things are going to be done. So with that, I have my color scheme. So the first choice was whether to just colorize the things on the left or to leave the entire middle blank. Because there is not a lot of content here, I went ahead and colorized the entire middle piece. If there was a lot of content, I may choose not to do something like that. And what I was talking about with heavy saturation is that with the low saturation colors, you can use black on them and they'll still be fairly legible. If you instead use a heavy contrast, then using a black font on that will be very difficult to see and you'll have to choose something else. Now the CSS framework that I chose to get everything to line up, so you'll see that as I pull these things across, you can see these things responsively resize. The CSS framework that I chose is called Bulma, and it is a CSS framework that is based off of Flexbox. So you can use the Bootstrap 3. Bootstrap 4, they're moving to Flexbox. And the Bootstrap version is a little more customizable. Flexbox is a bit wonky in certain respects as far as how it handles resizing. With the old float model, you set up very specific breakpoints and have it move around. Whereas with the Flexbox model, it kind of takes control over certain things, which generally you want, but it can be, let me try that again. It can be a little bit weird. Let's see. Whenever it gets to sizes like that. So you can see that immediately shifted to just having one container because it can't fit all three of them. And you would probably want to throw a breakpoint on there and then tell it to switch layout. So here it's just going one right after the other. But you can see these pictures are really large. If you did choose to make them width 100, so if I fly open the editor and I take off that width 100%, you can see here now you end up with all this white space, so then you would need to recenter this and do a few other things. So I'm just going with sort of the default of how it works rather than getting too deep into customization. The next big trick is how do you actually use this stuff? So here we define our color scheme. We also define a handful of filters that we're going to be reusing, and you try to name these things such that it makes sense. So blur 1 blurs by 1 pixel, sepia 50 converts it to a sepia tone of 50%. So you use the var keyword and then this little dash dash, and then you put in whatever the variable is that you're using. So for reset top, that's being used because without it, this thing will get pushed down kind of far, and I didn't like how that looked, so I just had it reset back up to the top. Then here I'm creating a bunch of background colors and I'm naming them after what they are. Same thing with the text. This is generally how I write my CSS. My CSS does not do a lot because if your CSS doesn't do a lot, you end up not having to do this too much. And I have to do this sort of stuff because Bulma kind of hijacks how images work if you have the image class. And oh, that was nice. So you can see there, here's where it was defined inside of Bulma. So then I have the header font, which is using the Playfair font, and this puts that right inside of there. I also name things what they are, and then I use the refactor inside of JetBrains whenever I want to rename things as their names change. I find this is a lot easier to read than some people kind of recommend a style. So header font they might agree with, but where I have the Playfair font, they might say head font, and then they would define a whole list of rules like this of what size it should be. Well, that'd be huge. How much padding it should have, line spacing, what is it, character spacing, or does it even know what this spacing is? There it is, 1 pix. So they would put all these rules inside of there and use it as one gigantic group. And so they say if you're doing that, you need to name it something semantic. I tend to just write one rule at a time, and then when I need multiple rules, I just write them out. And then by reading it, it's easy to see, and most importantly, you can erase a rule and not have it affect a huge amount of things, since the rule only does one thing and it's only being applied to this one class. This capitalized, that doesn't really need to be there because the font is capitalized by default, but it's there. And then the most fancy thing being done here is how to reduce contrast. So this applies all those different filters in sequence. So it converts to sepia, it blurs it, and then it desaturates it. And that just helps this image sort of blend into the background instead of jumping out quite as bright as it is. So that's a little bit of the design process and some of the tools that are being used. You can go through the Bulma docs, but it's pretty simple to get up and running with. And if you run through the repo, the way that it names things is also really nice. It's pretty easy to figure out what these things are actually going to do just by reading it. So that's also a pretty big help. Some of the Bootstrap stuff is a little non-semantic or kind of hard to go through. And the only fancy thing I'm using from it is this card that's in the Bootstrap 4 as well. I think I wrote my project in Bootstrap 4, but it's basically the same thing. A lot of these ideas you'll find in JavaScript frameworks and CSS frameworks, they sort of co-evolve into each other over time because they borrow the best ideas from other frameworks and then integrate them in. And that's where Bootstrap 4 is heading. But I like Bulma just because it's a little more lightweight, no JavaScript, no extra dependencies. So that's the design process. You pick an image, you grab the colors off of it, you pick out some good fonts, and then you just lay things out so that way they're easy to read. And then you just pay attention to things like contrast and making sure things can actually be read on side of the different fonts. So that's a brief look at sort of how I went about refactoring this page.